During the course of your presentation, you need to be thinking about and aware of how things are going. Are people starting to lose interest? Do they need a break? Do you need to do something different to change the pace? And when it's time to wrap up your presentation, you need to remind people about your basic message. Your real hope is that in a week from now, if someone asked the members of your audience, they'd be able to recall what your presentation was all about. It's something that depends greatly on your audience, but you have no control over their reactions. Your job is simply to ensure that you get your message across as persuasively as you possibly can. Here are some adjustments you can make if your audience seems to be losing interest. You can ask questions. You can have a member of the audience come to the front of the room and maybe help you with a demonstration. You can conduct an informal poll, a show of hands. How many people think that? Whatever. Introduce maybe an interesting digression. It's okay to go off topic for a couple of minutes as long as you come back. And use a brief story, which needs to be something that's to do with your topic. Now, what you're trying to do with these adjustments is just creating a change of pace. And if the audience is looking like it's losing interest, you can absolutely turn it around by reminding them there's a reason for them to listen. When you tell people to take a break, it's important to tell them exactly when you're planning to start again. 15 minutes is usually a typical length for a break. It gives people the time to stretch their legs, go to the bathroom and maybe get a cup of coffee. Shorter presentations, if you're under an hour, you're not generally going to need a break, but if you're heading towards maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours, it can be really useful to give people a break in the middle. People will sit for 2 hours plus in a movie theatre, but there's obviously a difference between a movie and a presentation. It's much easier to sit through a movie than it is through a presentation that's the same length. If you give a break to the audience in your presentation, it's really essential to specify exactly when you're going to start again and even do a time check of everyone's watches. What I like to do is say the time that I've got on my watch is 1:45, so I expect you all back in here at 11 o'clock, for example. If people stay out beyond the time for a break, it results in you starting late, which can give a really bad impression. If you've only got a couple of stragglers, then you can start again without them. Or if there's a lot of people still coming back into the room, you can have a short informal conversation with people who've either arrived back in time or have stayed in the room during the break. And doing that can actually be a really good way of gauging how your presentation is being received and allows you to get a bit of an impression of what your audience is liking. Sometimes a speaker will end a presentation with a question and answer session. If you do this, don't end the presentation with the answer to the last question because it mightn't have anything to do with your main point. Instead, after you've answered the last question, say something like, "That's all we have time for. If there's one thing I hope you remember from this presentation, it is." Doing this will end your presentation in a neat way and it pulls together the strands of the previous period of time. It lets you reinforce the central point of your presentation. And then obviously as people are leaving, thank them for attending. If people leave your presentation on a really positive note, they're more likely to remember what's happened before in positive light. Whatever else you do, you should also ensure that if people have follow-up questions, they can get them to you in any way possible. I generally write my email address up on the whiteboard and ask people if they've got anything they'd like to add or talk to me about, they can send me an email. The way you respond to questions is going to have a major effect on the rapport you build with your audience. If you answer questions thoughtfully and respectfully, people will feel that you're taking them seriously. If you give sort of flippant and dismissive answers, people will feel that you feel you don't have time for them. People can ask questions which aren't 100% serious, but even then you shouldn't be dismissive. Just take the question in the spirit it's intended and maybe even take the opportunity to display a sense of humour. Questions can be a great opportunity for you to get information in the presentation that you couldn't address due to time restraints. When someone asks a good question, you can begin your response with saying, "That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked me that. I think the most important thing here is that." If someone asks a question you can't answer or that's difficult, don't just say, "I don't know," but say something like, "That's a really good question. I have to admit I hadn't covered that issue. What do you think?" Or you can throw to the audience. You can ask people, "What do you think?" And that way you'll not lose respect, but you can allow the discussion to actually flow. At the end of your presentation, you say, "Does anyone have any questions?" And no one does. What do? You can wait for 20 seconds or so and then say, "Well, one question people often ask is," you can come up with your own question to show people what kinds of questions you expect. The question you come up with should be an easy one so people get the idea they don't have to ask something complicated or difficult. If your presentation is going longer than an hour, it's a good idea to allow questions at regular intervals. It's because the longer people sit there in silence, the less interest they show. Most presentations will be shorter than that, so you can hold off questions till the end. If you've got an hour in total for your presentation, you should look to be winding down at about the 45-minute mark and take questions in the last 15 minutes. This will allow you to answer questions and look for feedback on the answers. An open question and answer session really does enliven things. It makes people who participate in a group, gives everyone an opportunity, and what it actually does is reinforce what people are learning. At some point, someone in your audience might ask a question that sounds or feels like an attack. How do you respond? It's important not to confront the person. Don't say, no, I think you're wrong. You should affirm the person. Say, that's a really interesting point, but here's another way to look at that. I can see why you'd feel that way, but I was trying to make the point that. Point taken, I might have been too sweeping in my generalisation. Everyone in the room is going to be waiting to hear how you respond to the challenge. If you keep cool and say something positive before you answer, you'll impress the audience with your professionalism. Agree with the person as far as you can. You can state your disagreement in a non-confrontational way. I think we agree on XYZ, but not on ABC. Answering hostile questions with a hostile response simply makes the whole process tense. You're the person at the front of the room, and the person asking the question is with a number of other people. All it does is set you against a large group of people. And additionally, if you answer a hostile question by showing really good grace and considering the question on its positive merits, what actually happens is the hostile individual more often than not will back down from their position. Now let's look at dealing with complex questions. It's important to listen. So you're listening attentively to the question, make eye contact with the questioner, nod or give other indications of encouragement, don't interrupt. Paraphrase when it's appropriate. If the person asks a long and rambling question, you might want to paraphrase it before you respond. Say something like, let me be sure I understand you. You're asking, whatever it is you think they're asking. Then you analyse. Before responding, make sure you understand the question. Try and understand the intent of the questioner. Is he or she genuinely asking for clarification, or are they trying to disprove or challenge you? Watch for facial expressions and body language and listen for tone. Ask yourself, is there a broader issue behind this question that I need to address? Then you affirm. You make eye contact with the questioner again. Say something like, that's an interesting point. I'm really glad you brought that up. An affirmation of this kind is particularly important if the question is challenging. Then you answer. Don't duck a question or give a vague answer. If you don't know the answer, say so. You might want to tell the questioner you'll call him or her the next day with an answer. Give an honest answer. If the audience gets the impression you're trying to put one over them, you may as well pack up and go home. The question and answer session traditionally comes at the end of the presentation, so if you really shine in this section, people remember really clearly, and they'll remember you negatively if you duck questions or give dodgy answers. Ending on a positive note is really important in a presentation. If you can do that, you're most of the way to becoming a great public speaker. All right, that concludes our webinar on public speaking. I really hope you've enjoyed it and got something out of it. I'm Ros Cardinal, Managing Director of Shaping Change, and thanks for joining me.